All right, so just briefly, I started being very interested in family cookbooks when I was pregnant with my twins many, many decades ago. And I was looking for a recipe from my grandmother, and I couldn't find it. It was molasses spice cookies, and I was about 8 months pregnant, and my grandmother wasn't around, and my stepdaughter came to see me, and I said, "Oh, Chris, we really need to find this recipe." And so I remembered she had a jar of molasses, Brer Rabbit molasses on her shelf. And so I said, okay, well, we're going to go look for Brer Rabbit molasses. And off we go to this store, and lo and behold, there was a jar. And I go, terrific, except I turned it around, and there was a recipe for baked beans, and I was absolutely not interested in baked beans being so pregnant. But I did find that they had a phone number at the bottom of the jar, and so I called them. And they explained to me very nicely in the South, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Ms. Pruess, you happen to know that recipe appeared on our label in 1919, which made a lot of sense because it would have been when a lot of people got their recipes on packages and jars and whatever. And the woman was so nice, she said, I'll read you the recipe. So I remember writing it down, and I ran into the kitchen with my stepdaughter, and we started making these cookies. And along the way, I said, gee, my grandma did it slightly differently, which is one of the points I want to talk about, how we recreate recipes. So before I got to this august state, I should tell you I actually went to cooking school in Paris. I've written 14 books. I've written for a lot of well-known newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, Civil War, blah, blah, blah. But here I was looking for a cookie. And because I'm a cookie freak, and I wanted these cookies. So I made the first batch, and as I was making them, I said, my grandma didn't do it like this, so I started improvising. What you do is you mix the ingredients, you roll it, and then you put it in sugar. And we used to eat as many balls of raw dough as we did cook cookies. That being said, the first batch comes out, and I'm in my grandma's kitchen, and I am so excited. So, of course, the next day I decided, that made 5 dozen cookies. The next day I decided, well, I'm going to double it. So I made 10 dozen, 120 cookies. And the first batch had gone back to school with my stepdaughter into my husband's office. And the other batch, the second day went really almost as quickly. Now I am a few days later, and I'm going to make 5 times this recipe. So I make it, and I suddenly get these horrible cramps in my stomach, and I figured, well, maybe it's the molasses. Maybe I'm just eating too many balls of raw dough, whatever it is. So I decided to call up the obstetrician, and the nurse said, well, why don't you just come to the hospital? You're 5 weeks before your twins are due. I get to the hospital, including with my tin of cookies, and I'm telling a joke. They hadn't even registered me, and out pops my son, Ben. I thought it was a very fast and easy way to have a baby, but I still had another baby, and he flipped over, and 12 minutes later, we got into a delivery room, and he was born. Well, what ended up happening is lots of people came to visit. These nurses, these doctors, they said, and we hear you have these cute babies, and we hear you have these amazing cookies. So suddenly, these became the cookies that went around the world. My daughter, who lives in London, has put it up on her website. I've given it to chefs for their wives who are having babies. And this is one of the examples of family cookies or family recipes. Now, that's one way you get a recipe off of a jar. Another way you get them is probably from your grandmother or your great-grandmother or whomever it is. And I got a recipe from my great-grandmother. She used to come out from Chicago. I lived in California. She came out there, and she always came with boxes of cookies. And I was really excited. And I remember these white boxes with rubber bands around them. And I particularly liked a cookie called a pongacho. And eventually you're going to be sent some printed materials. One is how to create a Lost Family recipe that I wrote for PBS's online magazine. And the thing is that recipe I got from my great aunt. I was writing my first cookbook, and I'm going to show you, actually, this is what I got in the mail. This is, can you see, there is the envelope, and there is my great aunt's kind of spindly handwriting. and I get this recipe, and I was so excited that I made them, and it was in my very first cookbook. And then some years later, I was writing this article about how to create a lost family recipe, and I went back to my cousin who lives in Chicago. She goes to me, "No, that's not how my recipe is." And this is another thing you should know. When you get a family recipe, you don't always get the same versions. So you are going to have to be somewhat of a culinary sleuth to figure out which version you really love. Because my memory of these bogaccio was one thing, and I thought they were fine, except then when I tasted my cousin's, and they were that much better. So you want to be a bit of a sleuth, and you want to figure this all out, and what does that take? Well, the first thing you have to do is get recipes. And who are you going to ask? Yes, you can ask your cousins, and you can ask anybody else around who, I mean, and by the by, this is a family cookbook. If you want to have an adopted member of your family, nobody's saying you can't. But what you want to do, first of all, is go collect your recipes. And how many recipes do you want to make? Well, if you're from a prolific family that cooks a lot, I'm going to tell you 75 is a lot of recipes, and it's a lot of work. 100 is really a lot of work. But it's your recipe book. You decide what you want to do. Here's one of the things. If you can ask your cousin, because she's still here, and she may have a different version of the recipe that you love. But what about your mother or your grandmother? If your mom or even your grandmother is still alive, get into the kitchen now. Go collect these recipes. Watch. In my case, when I was watching my great-grandmother cook, she would put a little pinch of something like this, and she'd say, "You put a pinch." Or she measured cups of flours in a jam jar. We don't do that anymore. The goal is to try and make recipes that work. Not for you, because you know how to make them, but your daughter or your son or your grandchild, whatever, that's the thing. And the other thing about this, about who do you get them from, is we have electronic ways these days. If you could get a link to your grandmother or your cousin or whomever making these dishes. A cookbook is a cookbook of recipes, but it's much more. It's our connection to the past. It's our connection to feeling good, and it's our connection to the future. So as much other material, that's what's going to make your document a living, breathing, wonderful document. So yes, I have this one recipe from my great aunt, which is slightly different, as I said, from the one that she gave me the first time. So you gather them together. Now, what's going to constitute a recipe that you want? In my family, my mother, I'm one of 5 kids. My mother used to make 1.5 pounds of bacon every morning for breakfast. Can you imagine that? 1.5 pounds of bacon. Well, it was an alarm clock. She got us all up. And as the years went by, my mom used to make a great mac and cheese. The part we fought over the most was the crunchy top, the cheese. So I decided I was going to make my mom's mac and cheese, which I did in her old cast iron pot. But what I did is, first of all, let me show you. I took a big wide cast iron. I was writing a book about cast iron. I was writing a book about bacon. And this is the most inviting way to get people into your house and talking. And that's what you want them to do. So I made my mom's mac and cheese. The topping was with extra Parmesan and panko. So it was crunchy on the top, and it was yummy and whatever. And it had bacon in it. So that's my version of my mom's mac and cheese. For people who don't eat bacon, of course you can make it without bacon. But you know, my bacon book is called Seduced by Bacon. And you know what? When I was writing that, and when I was writing my cast iron books, I would talk to people, and do you know what's wonderful? You get people talking about their recipes, and that's how they connect. They want to tell you how they cooked in cast iron. They want to tell you how they cook bacon as a person. All of that is who you are. That's what's going to make this book so exciting, so makes your heart sing. And so that's what you want to do along with the recipes. You go ahead and you get your recipes in order. And you can divide them, as I said, you can do whatever number you want, but you want to divide them into chapters. It doesn't help to just list them. I mean, just put them one right after another because there's no order to it. So, and I would try for a somewhat even distribution. You can go the conventional way, which is soups, salads, main courses, vegetables, pastas, whatever you want, and desserts. It doesn't matter. What do you do the most? That's what you use. So I think fine. Go ahead and make your choices of chapters, and then you're going to set about getting these recipes. And what you need to do is, where do you start? You've gathered them together, and now what you want to do is you want to start testing them. And you know what? That is one of the most critical things, along with getting your family story. I think testing and correctly documenting, which we're going to get to in a minute, are the most important things. Because you can make a recipe that works, but it doesn't taste like what you started out to make. So the bottom line is, you're going to get them, you're going to choose the recipes that I would start and prioritize by giving them 5 as a top, and choose the ones that really speak to you. So and if you have enough, that's enough, fine. If you go to your 4-star ones, that's fine. Whatever it is, you're the determinant, so it's not going to be a problem. So then the other thing you want to do is you want to get your family involved, and you want to share with them. You can also sometimes make it as a charity project, which is always fun. But I think what you need to do is really create the aura, the atmosphere of what this world is in which you're creating your recipes. And so to that end, I would say, once you have collected them, what are you going to do with the different versions? And how are you going to decide? I mean, these are, I think you need some sort of like tips, my rules, the way I decide what I'm going to do. And so the first thing I do is I say, okay, I need to have this recipe, and you're going to have to test it, as I said. And you may have to make 3 versions. If you don't find the version you like, I'll tell you, there's something amazing called the internet these days. You can find similar recipes. None of these were so original. But you do need to you need to test them. In order to get a recipe to be tested, you first have to write it down. And writing it down is the following. You have to order the ingredients. You have to order the greatest quantity of an ingredient that is used at the same time, then lesser and lesser. And so I'm going to say, for example, when I make my molasses spice cookies, the first thing it starts out with is 1.5 sticks, 6 ounces of unsalted butter. And to that, you add 1.5 cups of sugar plus 1/2 cup of sugar. Why did I separate it? Why are they divided? Because the sugar is added at 2 different times and for 2 different purposes. At first, it's added with the butter, and that last 1/2 cup of sugar is what you're going to roll the little cookie balls in. So you want to, it's easier if you don't say, either you say 2 cups divided, but I actually prefer to say 2 cups. I prefer the 1.5 cup and 1/2 cup. And then you have this thing called dark molasses, and I remember I told you about molasses. Here we go. And it's fine if you're here and you know what if you're in America, and a lot of us have grown up with molasses. But when I was in London, for example, cooking with my daughter, we actually found it at Whole Foods, we found it at Harrods, and more American products are being exported. And there's also something called the internet, Amazon. Amazon certainly has it. So, but you want to explain these ingredients if you're making it for the first time, if somebody doesn't know what it is. If you're making an Indian dish and you have a spice mixture that they don't know, I think, and your family may include people from around the world, so you need to explain that. And that's going to all come under what I call the sidebar or head note information. Sidebar and head notes are going to tell you what the recipe looks like, what it tastes like. It could be, the sidebar can be if it came from Aunt Mary, or it could be an experience where you found it. I think, as I said, all of this is going to enrich what you're doing. But it is important. It's important that people know, and also the source for where they can find it. Again, they can, obviously in this day and age, when I started out, there was no internet, or there was no Amazon, and we would go to ethnic markets, and it was fun. But I think by putting a head note, what's called a head note, or a sidebar, and you could put those silly and fun stories, and you could put your pictures in it. This is how we're getting these recipes to be exciting. So we're going to order it. Now we're going to talk about measuring ingredients. You know, we talked about the order. We talked about putting in the greatest quantity first and then working down. But when you measure ingredients, and let's say your recipe says a bunch of parsley. And let me show you, this is a bunch of parsley. It's one bunch of parsley. Have you ever bought a bunch of parsley that was much smaller, maybe that big? Have you ever gone to a farmer's market and they give you a gigundous bunch of parsley? So what does that mean to your recipe? So technically you could, I mean, if it's a stew or a soup, you could probably put in whatever you want. But let's say your recipe calls for parsley, and the more correct way, or the more exact way, because let's say you have parsley, and then you say you want to measure a half a cup of parsley. Well, you could try and get that into the cup. It's not going to be the same. Technically, you want to say 1/2 cup chopped parsley. So do you see the difference? Because if, in fact, you chop the parsley up, and then you get to this measuring cup, and you get approximately, you're going to get a flavor profile. There is something you should add, that many ingredients can vary in taste, in pungency. You know, it's like America's taste for spice has gotten much higher, or many people's taste around the world has gotten, their tolerance for spice. Americans, you know, if you say salt to taste, well, guess what? We eat more salt these days. So if you're going back to recreate your grandmother's recipe, and you go, oh my goodness, this is really boring. And you may not have remembered it as being boring, but the answer is, this is your recipe for today. If you want your recipe to have more salt or more spice or whatever, you could either write a note that I've added more salt, or you could put salt to taste. But it's really important, if you're measuring flavoring spices, that you take measuring spoons, and you fill them, and you level it off, because otherwise it's going to vary. And if you are trying very hard to make this be exactly like it was, then it's on you to measure as accurately as you can. That goes right along when you ask somebody to test it. So, you know, one of the things is you're measuring, but testing is really, as I've said, essential. So I gave some of my recipes to a friend who is a good cook, and I asked her to test them. And what ended up happening is, I got the recipe back, and I go, Wendy, this doesn't taste like my recipe. She said, well, I didn't have the same kind of mustard you did. And, well, I didn't have this, that, and the other thing. So I said, well, guess what? That's not going to work. So you kind of have to be hard-nosed about it, and you have to say, yes, you want a certain amount of consistency. You also want to write your recipes consistently, so as it goes forward. And sometimes people put little lines at the bottom of them saying notes, because there used to be notes in all kinds of things. I think that's great if somebody wants to add to it. But I think it's really important that recipes are tested and documented. And another reason for getting them tested is, not only do some people leave out ingredients. I'm going to say that I wrote some articles for some pretty prestigious magazines. And at one point it was supposed to be a teaspoon and a half of salt, half a teaspoon of salt, and they wrote a half a tablespoon of salt. So guess what? That would have made a big difference. So you really have to remember to be consistent. The other reason to test, I mean, aside from just validating the flavor, is that you want to know that the method is written correctly. Sometimes people they forget a step, and lo and behold, they come up and they go, what do I do with the vanilla? It's not in there. So that's really why I'm saying it's so important to test your recipes and to write them down in order. And so the other things I'm saying finally is just make sure you get your family's voices in there. You can, as I said, add pictures, add links. As I said, just go get those stories documented. I think that the stories are going to be the most exciting part of what you're doing. Make sure you invite your family over and your friends to eat in your kitchen. And as they are eating, they're going to share stories. And it's going to bring up more memories for you. And I think that's very exciting because I have cooked with my grandsons now. And my one grandson said, I didn't know that, or I would tell him how I would cook for the kids when they were young. I didn't know that. There's something very enchanting about that. And there's nothing wrong with making your own. You can start out a head note by saying, this is Mary Giovanni's recipe for whatever, minestrone. But I decided I didn't like this, and I've added green beans, or I've added that. I think in the end of the day, it's really important simply to make it your own and then say why. I mean, it's not just I've made it my own. It's, you know what, in my family, we didn't like lima beans. So you didn't put lima beans in it. But a long time ago, a lot of minestrones had lima beans. You end up repeating the same principles and then simply making it better, or you want to make it better. If you want to make it just exactly how your grandmother made it, I get it. I mean, Lydia Bastianich gave me a recipe, which is in that article, and she talked about the hardships. She came from a pretty hard scrabble background, and she's a very famous chef today. But she talked about going into her grandmother's kitchen, and how so much of this just brought it's comforting, it's security. And I think what we all are seeking right now is the comfort of home cooked meals, and the security it gives, the sense of security. I think that's really marvelous. There's a fine line you walk. Do you want it to be exactly the same? Do you want to go back in time and measure with old-fashioned measurements? I'm not that kind of purist. I'm seeking to recreate the experience of my family background and my family, including my extended family, and moving that forward. If I was trying to do a historical project, as I said, you can go online. There are historical societies where you can go look for family recipes. Amazingly, so much of that is online. But you have to decide whether you're going to do it exactly. Are you going to use shortcuts? There were no food processors back in the day. Are you going to finely chop? And that's a lot. There's a lot of things that take chopping. If I'm making certain, like mirepoix, if I'm making the base for soup, sometimes I put them all in a food processor and pulse them, so that I get an equal amount of different vegetables, celery, onions, and carrots, and then I start sauteing. Sometimes I am in the mood to just cook really slowly, and I do chop by hand. But remember, we're all busy. The way you cook is your comfort zone. I'm going to say it again. You are not going to make a Jamie Oliver book. You are going to make a book that is going to be as priceless as a Jamie Oliver recipe for your family. So with that, I'm going to say, if you don't have any questions, I'm going to say thank you very much for putting up with all this. This was not easy. I appreciate your time. And please be in touch. Again, Martin at Reedsy, there are a lot of classes on and webinars on Reedsy. And I would love to hear from you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.